He didn't die on the battlefield. He didn't die in a blaze of sword-clashing, hymn-singing, lion-hearted glory. Richard Plantagenet, yes, that Richard, died in a ditch, groaning, smelling, melting. This was the Lionheart, a man who, by all accounts, should have exploded into legend while skewering heathens on a crusade or wrestling a bear shirtless in the Alps. Instead, he lay half-naked in a field in central France, clutching a festering hole in his armpit. Not exactly Shakespearean. The wound was small, ridiculous even. A crossbow bolt, fired from a low wall by a teenager, likely barefoot and laughing. Not a knight, not a rebel prince. A boy with decent aim and no idea he'd just rewritten European history. And Richard, the man who had stormed Acre, defied Saladin, terrified his own nobles, didn't die quickly. He decayed, slowly, like overripe meat left in the sun. First came the swelling, then the fever, then the stink. By the time his knights carried him to a makeshift tent, the smell was so rich it overpowered the incense. One chronicler described it as the odor of judgment. Another fainted, or pretended to. Who could blame him? The wound should have been nothing, a gash beneath the arm. But in 1199, a small hole in your body was basically an RSVP to death, signed in pus and sealed with flies. No antibiotics, no antiseptics, just grease, lard, and a few well-meaning barbers with knives blunter than a monk's sex life. They tried everything: wine, honey, prayers. One even suggested placing a saint's relic on the wound. The relic, for the record, was someone's toe bone. That toe did nothing. Richard screamed until his voice broke, then begged for silence. He'd commanded armies across continents. Now he could barely command his own breath. And still, he gave orders, issued decrees, signed parchments with trembling fingers while his skin blackened and peeled. Pride is a stubborn beast, and kings are its most tragic victims. But here's the irony. The man who embodied brute survival, who'd survived captivity, betrayal, famine, ambush, crusade, and family reunions, which were arguably worse, could not survive a boy's arrow and a week without antibiotics. He knew it too. "Let him go," he reportedly said when the boy was brought before him. He did what many would wish to do. Some called it mercy, others called it delirium. He died that night, not roaring, not praying, not even speaking, just leaking. By dawn, the tent was silent. His men didn't know whether to mourn or disinfect the ground. His body was so ripe it had to be embalmed in stages. The heart went to Rouen, the entrails stayed nearby, and the rest of him was shipped off to Fontevraud Abbey, one piece at a time, like a cursed puzzle. There was no grand funeral, no golden casket paraded through the capital, just whispers, and the stench of something far older than death. Humiliation. Because in the end, Richard didn't get the death of a lion. He got the death of a man, a mortal, a body, a wound. And sometimes, that's more terrifying than 1,000 arrows. Chalus-Chabrol wasn't a fortress. It was a glorified barn with delusions of grandeur. A stubby castle squatting in the Limousin hills, with moss on its stones and pigs rooting too close to the moat. If it had a motto, it would have been, "Please ignore us." And yet, Richard the Lionheart, King of England, Duke of Aquitaine, slayer of Saracens, heir of Eleanor's fury, marched there with siege engines. Why? Because someone said there was gold, buried gold, Roman gold, maybe even Caesar's gold, if you squinted and suspended disbelief like a peasant over a tax ledger. Treasure hunters had whispered about it for years, and apparently Richard had run out of dragons to slay. So he came, with troops, catapults, and a royal sense of entitlement. The villagers, for their part, were unimpressed. They didn't scream or scatter. They peered from windows, chewed their onions, and shrugged. One old man farted audibly when the king's banner crested the hill. The castle's garrison, if you could call it that, was a ragtag collection of tired men, a few archers, and a dog that barked only when it felt like it. Richard set up camp anyway, ordered his men to build ladders, raise tents, prepare for siege, the usual theater. He expected surrender within days. Instead, the defenders hurled insults. One called his beard a squirrel's nest of shame. Another compared his royal backside to a salted ham left too long in the sun. These were not your typical terrified serfs. They had nothing to lose, no legacy, no crusade glory to preserve, just pig pens, stubbornness, and perhaps the joy of annoying a king with too much time on his hands. And then someone shot the arrow. It wasn't a volley, not part of a coordinated attack. Just one shot from one of the towers. A twitch of a finger, and fate rewrote itself. The bolt struck under Richard's armpit, a soft, deadly place where armor didn't reach. At first he laughed, pulled it out himself like a man swatting a bee. Blood welled, sure, but he'd bled before. It was just another scar in the making, except this time the laughing stopped. By nightfall he was sweating, feverish, muttering to himself about ships and lions and his mother's wine. His tent stank of vinegar and rot. The wound turned purple, then black. And the siege, once theatrical, became tragicomic. His men kept bombarding the walls, flinging rocks at a structure that looked ready to collapse on its own. Villagers kept watching. Some brought out bread and cheese to the battlements, a picnic with a view of royal failure. No reinforcements came, no miracles arrived, just more pus. And still, the village held. It was absurd, like watching a bear trip over a mouse, then die of shame. Richard had faced Salah ad-Din and lived. Now he was dying because a teenager with a twitchy thumb got lucky from 40 paces. By the time the castle finally surrendered, Richard couldn't even sit up. They brought the boy to him, skinny, nervous, probably 14 at most. He'd expected torture. Instead, the king let him go. Some say Richard whispered, "What is a king to a wound?" Others say he said nothing, just stared, blank-eyed, as if the whole farce had broken his spirit before his body. The villagers watched as the king's army packed up. No cheers, no jeers, just quiet awe. They'd survived a siege with insults, stubbornness, and a single arrow, and they had changed the course of history, not with power, but with sheer absurdity. For years afterward, locals told the tale. How the king came for gold and left a ghost. How their pigs outlasted a monarch. How a castle with fewer defenders than a tavern brawl brought an empire to its knees. They didn't put up a plaque. They didn't write poems. But they remembered. Because sometimes history isn't made by kings. Sometimes it's made by villages that dare to laugh when they're supposed to kneel. There was no ceremony, no thunderclap, no divine sign, just the soft thwip of a crossbow string, and that was it, the sound that cracked an empire. The arrow wasn't gilded, it wasn't even particularly sharp, forged by some anonymous blacksmith who probably wiped his nose with the same rag he used to polish blades. Shot by a boy no one bothered to name. And yet it pierced more than flesh. It ruptured a lineage, a crusade, a dream. Richard had no legitimate heirs. His crown sat heavy on a bloodline, already fraying at the edges. With his death, everything turned to smoke. The Anglo-Norman Empire, the fragile unity between English and French lands, the illusion that power could be passed like a loaf of bread at dinner. That arrow carried rot, yes, but it also carried silence. Silence where there had been roars. Silence in the councils, as men argued not about victory, but about who gets what now. The chronicles barely mention the boy. Some say his name was Pierre. Others claim he was just a servant. One version paints him as an avenging brother. Another insists he fired by accident, trying to hit a chicken. The truth? We'll never know, because no one expected the king to die. They thought he'd shake it off. He always had. Richard was a walking myth, built like a statue, immune to death by sheer narrative momentum. But when he didn't get up, when the tent stayed zipped, people started rewriting their allegiances faster than monks copying psalms under threat of plague. And the boy? Some say he was flayed alive the moment Richard's body cooled. Others say he fled and lived a long, boring life, haunted not by guilt, but by disbelief that the world changed because of him. But perhaps the most disturbing thing was how ordinary it all was. The arrow wasn't enchanted. The shot wasn't guided by fate. It wasn't a duel or a prophecy or a betrayal in the night. It was just a moment, like slipping in the bath, like choking on bread. It reminded everyone that legacy is fragile, that no matter how many castles you build, how many battles you win, how many songs are sung about your courage, your end can come from a half-rusted bolt flung by a kid with poor hygiene. Richard's death marked the end of something bigger than himself. The Plantagenets never truly recovered their unity. England spiraled, France seized its moment. The Crusader states looked west and saw nothing. A lion fell, and no one roared in his place. That, more than anything, is what killed the legend. Not the wound, not the fever, not the pus-soaked linens, but the silence that followed. Eleanor of Aquitaine rode into camp like thunder in human form. 77 years packed into a spine that still refused to bow. Her cloak was black, but the woman beneath it was iron and ember both, glowing with a heat age hadn't managed to bank. As her horse stopped before the ruined tent, men who'd survived sieges felt their legs consider bending, not to grief, to her. Inside, attendants scrambled, stuffing blood-spotted linens into crates, trying to erase the evidence that Richard, her brightest, most troublesome jewel, had died smelling like a butcher's trash heap. They failed, of course. No amount of lavender could hide 6 days of royal putrefaction. Eleanor inhaled once, eyes watering, and stepped forward anyway. Grief had never frightened her. She'd buried 2 husbands, 3 children, and at least one illusion about love. A little sweet rot didn't rank. The corpse, half wrapped in waxed cloth, looked shockingly small. Richard had filled every room he'd entered. Now he occupied no more space than bad memory. His beard was stiff with clotted gore, mouth tilted, as if about to argue that this whole death business was badly scheduled. Eleanor touched his cheek. Skin gave beneath her fingers like soaked parchment. That single gesture launched the performance of a lifetime. Because Eleanor didn't come only as a mother, she came as architect of dynasties. The empire Richard left behind was a table with 3 unsteady legs, and every carrion lord in Europe was sharpening a carving knife. If she wept openly, they'd smell weakness. If she appeared cold, they'd accuse her of murder. So she chose a middle path, grief exactly measured, tears brimming but not spilling, voice lowered to a register that forced every man present to lean closer. Record his face, she told the circle of nobles who'd crept in behind her, pretending devotion but really sniffing for power. This is what ambition costs. A pause, perfectly timed. And what betrayal earns. Eyes dropped, throats cleared. She'd named no traitor, yet each baron felt the accusation fit like a tailored noose. Politics, seasoned with the scent of decay, irresistible. She worked the room like a troubadour sings a lament, soft verses for loyalty, sharp refrains for anyone considering revolt. Over the corpse, she crafted alliances in murmurs. Aquitaine would recognize John's claim if John confirmed Aquitaine's ancient rights. Poitou would keep its charters if it kept its soldiers in line. She even summoned the castle's garrison captain, the man whose walls had nursed the fatal arrow, and forgave him with a smile thin as parchment. Mercy was cheaper than war and twice as shocking. Outside, word spread that the Queen Mother was negotiating with death itself. Soldiers gathered in tight knots, whispering how she stood beside a reeking body, yet looked fresher than spring wheat. How, when she spoke, the flies seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to land on her velvet. Legends sprout from smaller seeds. Night fell, torches spat resinous smoke. Still she remained. She oversaw the gruesome logistics personally, heart exhumed and sealed in silver for Rouen. His courage belongs there, she said. Entrails salted into a lead box for Chalus. Let Limousin remember the price of pride. The rest of him swaddled in linen steeped in wine so strong it could set a monk ablaze. Every slice of royal anatomy carried a message, and Eleanor chose the recipients like a general distributing weapons. At some hour past midnight, she finally allowed herself solitude. The tent flap dropped, the world fell away, and the iron cracked, just enough. She knelt, steady hands suddenly shaking, pressed her forehead to the cold linen over his ribs, and whispered the name he'd borne before titles, Ricardus. She reminded him of sunshine in Poitiers courtyards, of songs he sang badly but loudly, of the peach he stole from her lap when he was 5 and declared the sweetest fruit in Christendom. A sob punched through her chest, raw, ugly, human. Only one attendant heard it, a novice nun acting as scribe. She would later swear that when Eleanor stood again, the sob was still echoing in the canvas rafters, but the Queen's eyes were dry, 2 flint chips ready to spark the continent. Ink, Eleanor ordered, and parchment. That night, she drafted letters that would sail faster than rumor to Pope Innocent, requesting prayers loud enough to drown French ambitions, to Philip Augustus, coupling condolences with a reminder of every treaty Richard had forced him to sign, to John, dear, unreliable John, commanding him to kneel at Rouen before his brother's heart or forfeit his own. She sealed each missive with crimson wax impressed by her signet, a lion flanked by lilies, roaring even in death. When dawn bled pale across the camp, Eleanor emerged. Her cloak now carried Richard's scent. No one dared mention it. She mounted without help, eyes scanning ranks of men suddenly leaderless. "We ride to Fontevraud," she said. "History is waiting." And like that, the army moved. Thousands of boots crunching frost, hooves drumming resignation, wagons creaking beneath the weight of a fragmented king. As the procession wound south, villagers watched from doorways, crossing themselves at the smell that drifted past. Wine, myrrh, and underlying all, something spoiled. Mothers clutched children closer. Old men spat to keep bad luck out. But Eleanor rode straight-backed, letting the wind tug strands of silver hair loose. She had turned death into a banner, grief into ammunition. Whatever power remained in the Plantagenet name now perched on her saddle. Behind her, in a shadowed cart, Richard's torso jostled with every rut in the road, tissue slapping bone like applause for a play already ended. Yet in the hush between wheel squeaks, you could almost hear Eleanor's unspoken vow. "The curtain falls when I say so, not before." And in that vow, the empire found its last, reluctant breath. Richard's body was barely cool when knives began to glint in candle-lighted corridors. A king's flesh, it turned out, was prime real estate. Everyone wanted a piece, and not just the literal ones Eleanor had already parceled out like gruesome party favors. The moment her procession vanished over the horizon, Europe's most ambitious men sniffed opportunity the way hounds scent blood on snow. And they followed the smell straight to the coffin. Start with John Lackland, Richard's runt of a brother, the prince famous for owning more debts than acreage and more grudges than friends. News of Richard's death reached him in Normandy while he was fittingly gambling. The messenger arrived panting, mud-spattered, eyes so wide you'd think he'd seen God misfiled. John folded his cards, pocketed the pot, and muttered, "At last." Then he vomited. Relief, nerves, or too much wine, nobody could tell. But moments later he was barking orders to saddle every horse in reach. If he moved fast enough, he could wrap the English crown round his thinning hair before anyone noticed it didn't quite fit. Across the channel, a boy of 12 stared at the same black ink news and gripped a toy sword until his knuckles blanched. Arthur of Brittany, Richard's nephew, Geoffrey's son, was by most accounts sweet-faced, bookish, and entirely unprepared for power. But he had a claim, and in royal succession, a claim is a lit match in a barn full of straw. His mother Constance whispered that destiny was calling. His tutors whispered that John was a snake. His own heartbeat whispered that he was terribly, gloriously alive. Children grow fast when crowns dangle within arm's reach. Hovering above them both was Philip Augustus of France, the Spider King whose web stretched from Flanders tides to Burgundy vineyards. He read the dispatch in Paris while priests droned mass behind him, then smiled so faintly it barely disturbed the candle flame. England's lion was dead. Now the cubs would brawl. All he had to do was nudge them toward each other and collect whatever pieces fell off. War, to Philip, was less thunder and more accountancy. Add allies, subtract enemies, calculate interest on chaos. Meanwhile, Richard's corpse, what remained of it, lay in Fontevraud Abbey, thronged by pilgrims who wanted miracles and found instead a smell like damp leather and extinguished torches. They pressed hands to the stone slab, praying for courage, fertility, cheaper taxes, anything a dead crusader might still grant. Monks pocketed donations, muttering psalms, while secretly tallying which relic markets would buy a splinter of the king's coffin wood. Holiness, after all, was a booming enterprise. Back on political ground, letters flew faster than arrows. One rode south to Aquitaine, promising leniency if its lords backed John. Another streaked north, offering tax cuts if they crowned Arthur. Seals popped, wax dripped, riders changed horses until hoofprints latticed the countryside like frantic stitches. Somewhere in Champagne, two couriers passed each other on a moonlit road, each carrying orders that, if obeyed, would make the other irrelevant. They exchanged nods, too exhausted to realize they were twin sparks on the same fuse. Eleanor, ever the chessmaster, saw the board tilting. At Rouen, where Richard's pickled heart thumped softly in a silver urn, she summoned nobles one by one into the cathedral's echoing nave. Columns soared like judgment. Stained glass bled crimson sunrise across polished mail. She spoke little, simply placed her palm on the urn and asked, "Will you protect what he loved?" No one dared answer no to a heart still technically beating in the mind of legend. Pledges piled up like shields before a storm, but pledges are parchment. Ambition is fire. John arrived days later, boots muddy, grin thin as wire. He knelt before the urn, kissed it theatrically, and proclaimed himself defender of his brother's memory. That memory, however, came with debts. Ransoms still owed to the Holy Roman Emperor, wages to unpaid mercenaries, wine to thirsty courts. John promised everything, paid nothing. Coins were scarce, trust scarcer. Every unpaid knight was a future dagger. Arthur, shepherded by Brittany's warlords, marched toward Anjou with banners bright as spring blossoms. Peasants gawked, a boy leading men grown hard as oak. He distributed bread from his own panniers, listened to their grievances, quoted scripture with a voice that cracked at inconvenient vowels. They loved him for it. Idealism, like plague, spreads quickest among the poor. While armies mustered, Philip Augustus penned treaties so intricately worded they resembled spider silk, beautiful, invisible, and meant to ensnare. He courted Arthur, flattered John, even sent condolences to Eleanor, masking conquest behind courtesy. Each letter a velvet-clad dagger, each seal a smile hiding fangs. And every chess move echoed back to Fontevraud, where Gregorian chants struggled beneath the footfalls of restless power. The abbey's candles burned through night after night, their smoke spiraling up to rafters like the souls of men already marked for the coming wars. Because Richard's corpse was more than a king gone rotten. It was a throne without a spine, a map without borders, a question no sword could answer cleanly. Whoever claimed him, his relics, his legends, his debts, claimed the right to bleed for what he left unfinished. When spring finally tipped into summer, banners unfurled across Normandy's hedgerows, red dragons, black lions, golden lilies. Villagers watched colors clash on the horizon and whispered that the dead king's wound had spread to the land itself, a suppurating hole everyone kept poking with steel. Flies thickened over battlefield trenches the way they had over Richard's armpit, and the smell of pus became the smell of mud, sweat, and smoke. Somewhere between two skirmishes, a rumor sprouted that Richard's ghost stalked the edges of camps, helm under one arm, demanding to know who wore his crown. Men swore they heard a lion's roar in night mists, felt a phantom gauntlet tap their shoulders before sleep. Superstition? Certainly. Yet more than one lord woke screaming, clutching at their side as if struck by a crossbow bolt they couldn't remove. Eleanor, too, felt the haunting. From her chamber, she could hear distant war drums thudding like a heart that refused to stay buried. She'd staged the final curtain, but the play raged on, audience now armed and unruly. Closing lines were impossible when every actor wanted center stage. So the Queen Mother prayed, plotted, and waited, knowing that battlefields would decide what royal councils could not. John or Arthur, kingdom or kindling. Either way, Richard's corpse had achieved one final conquest. He had turned Europe itself into the theater of his lingering, putrefying absence, and the world would not smell clean again for a very long time. Steel slit skin. That part every warrior accepted. The real gamble started after the blade withdrew, when air, dirt, and microbes no monk could name marched into the wound like looters after a fire. In the 12th century, an inch-deep cut was a dice throw against a stacked house, because death's favorite weapon wasn't iron. It was infection, invisible and patient. Richard's gangrenous armpit was only the latest headline in a story kings knew too well. Charlemagne's grandson Lothair bled from a minor leg gash and rotted by degrees. William the Conqueror's belly wound puffed until it exploded during embalming, drenching horrified clergy in royal gases. Even Crusader icon Godfrey de Bouillon, spear of Christendom, survived spear thrusts in Jerusalem only to die later of a fever most scholars now blame on an abscess that burst somewhere unmentionable. Medieval combat manuals offered pages on how to swing a sword, but not a single line on how to scrub one. Blades were wiped on cloaks that had scraped stable muck, arrowheads rusted in leather quivers beside moldy bread, armor bruised flesh, bruises turned to boils, boils opened like sinners' mouths. No wonder knights prayed to saints of sores more fervently than to saints of strategy. Doctors, if they dared the title, believed pus was God's applause for healing. Laudable suppuration, they called it, nodding at yellow ooze as proudly as bakers at rising dough. They saw the body as four squabbling humors. Imbalance caused illness, so solutions chased equilibrium with leeches, laxatives, or holes drilled into the skull to vent bad air. A surgeon might dress a lance wound with a poultice of warm dung and vinegar, the logic being that filth would draw out deeper filth, a kind of moral peer pressure among toxins. Kings, for all their command, submitted to the same cures. In winter courts, you could smell politics and putrefaction mingling like cheap wine. Courtiers sniffled behind perfumed kerchiefs as royal ankles ballooned, swords rested across swaddled ulcers, and someone always coughed blood onto the dais right before dinner. The line between throne room and infirmary blurred. Power sat on a cushion stuffed with fever dreams. Richard had studied enough campaigns to learn this terror intimately. He traveled with his own barber surgeon, a man whose equipment box clanked with saws, hooks, cautery irons, and a horn to funnel wine into screaming mouths. At Acre, Richard ordered seawater poured over arrow holes. Brine stung like betrayal, but slowed rot. Yet in Limousin he grew careless, shrugged off the bolt as a trifle, dismissed warnings that spring mists carried curses. One lapse of hygiene, and the boastful heart melted faster than snow on a torch. Word of his agony raced along trade routes faster than silk or salt. In taverns from Bordeaux to Bristol, travelers repeated the lesson. If even the Lionheart can fester, what chance do we sheep have? Mothers hissed at children picking scabs. Soldiers sharpened blades yet muttered about splinters. Infection was democracy at its bleakest, no one too titled, too pious, or too terrifying to escape decay. The church stepped into the panic with relics and rituals. Pilgrims queued to kiss St. Roch's fingerbone, patron of plague. They drank water filtered through silver reliquaries. Certain precious metal scared sickness, the way bells scare crows. But silver did little inside a body already turning black. Priests declared boils a test of faith, fevers a cleansing fire, until they themselves collapsed into communion wine, pupils glassy, skin blotched purple as bruised grapes. Against this backdrop, a new profession sprouted: spicers, wandering apothecaries peddling clove oil, myrrh, and foreign resins. They preached that good odors fought evil vapors, so castles burned cinnamon at banquet hearths, while the kitchens swarmed with rats. Nobles paid fortunes for saffron poultices. Peasants rubbed nettles on cuts to sting out corruption. Every remedy stank of desperation, and most wounds stank worse afterward. Some rare healers stumbled on progress. In Salerno, Mediterranean physicians rinsed injuries with distilled alcohol, noting recoveries slightly less gruesome. But knowledge traveled slower than legends. By the time such methods reached England, they were wrapped in hearsay, miscopied, or branded heresy. The greatest libraries preserved Greek treatises, yet one misread line could turn boiled water into boiled butter, and the patient into lunch for maggots. So kings learned dread. Beneath jeweled gauntlets, many wore amulets stuffed with antiseptic herbs, sage, hyssop, rue, more out of hope than science. Before tourneys, heralds splashed lances with rosewater, a ritual masquerading as sanitation. Some rulers banned rusty weapons in duels, not for chivalry, but for fear that brown steel harbored demons. Royal armorers polished plate until it shone like prophecy, partly to impress, mostly to repel filth. Yet rust always found a seam. Sweat softened skin, buckles pinched. A parade blister opened, rot slipped in. A month later, a duke's leg was amputated by torchlight, bone hacked dull blade, the stump cauterized while trumpeters drowned out screams, music as anesthetic. Survivors toasted his valiant endurance while sidling away from the smell. Richard's demise became the ultimate cautionary tale. Minstrels sang not just of valor, but of that single careless wound, describing pus with poetry usually reserved for spring meadows. Castles built new infirmary chambers. Squires were whipped for leaving mail damp. A few forward-thinking abbots even ordered wells lined in stone to curb contaminated runoff. Small steps, yes, but the arrow under the king's arm had pricked the era's conscience. Still, swords gleamed, wars raged, and infection kept the ledger. Long after Richard's bones settled beneath abbey dust, a Lancastrian prince would die from a splintered spear in his thigh, and a Valois king from a splintered lance through the eye. Both felled less by trauma than by what seeped through splinters. It would take 4 more centuries, the discovery of invisible animalcules, and finally Fleming's moldy petri dish to break infection's monopoly on victory. Until then, every battlefield victory ended with a second battle in the body. And more often than not, as Richard's rotting roar reminded a continent, the unseen enemy won. The tent was a furnace of damp cloth and fever-thick air when they dragged the boy inside. He was small, no taller than the king's sword had been long, and his ankles rattled inside a pair of iron fetters clearly forged for bigger criminals. His tunic, a homespun gray, was smeared with castle soot and the sticky yellow of half-ripe plums. Someone had shoved a helmet over his thatch of hair on the march to camp. It slid down now, clanging against his ears, making him look less like a prisoner and more like a child playing at war. Outside, the siege had gone eerily quiet. Engines rested, ropes slack, as if the entire army were leaning toward this canvas to hear the verdict. They'd waited 6 days, 6 nights of groans, prayers, and the sound of flesh breaking its last treaty, to know what the Lionheart would decree when he finally met the boy who ruined empires. Richard lay propped on cushions that oozed wine and pus. His beard, once burnished gold, had turned gray where sour sweat dried. His eyelids fluttered like torn banners. Yet when the captive stumbled forward, something in the king's gaze sharpened, as though his dying blood remembered the thrill of choosing life or death for others. Power, the final taste a ruler forgets. "Closer," Richard rasped. The guards shoved. Shackles scraped wood. The boy stood at the edge of the fur, feet bare, eyes darting between royal face and the wound beneath Richard's arm, all black mottled green, like rotten apples after harvest. He swallowed, Adam's apple jerking, and the whole tent seemed to flinch with him. "What is your name?" the king asked. Silence. Then a voice no louder than the buzzing flies. "No name, sire." Local dialect, village tongue. The way he clipped his consonants made every noble present sneer inwardly. Peasants were supposed to mumble, not kill legends. Richard's cracked lips curved upward. Whether it was amusement or agony, no one could tell. "Why did you shoot?" he pressed on. The boy's answer came halting, a confession threaded through terror. He'd stood on the battlements because everyone else had fled the hail of arrows. He'd seen the king's bright cloak, the lions of England shimmering in sunset, and thought, here was a target worth the single bolt his father had left him. No orders, no revenge. Curiosity. Could he hit the bright shape before dusk hit it? Richard coughed, a wet, ripping sound. His chest heaved. A copper stink filled the pause. He gestured weakly for wine, sipped, let most spill across his chin. The boy watched a drop slide down the lion-patterned blanket, and his face pinched as if he too could feel its heat. A chamberlain, eyes swollen from sleeplessness, bent to the king's ear. "Mercy," he whispered. would look like weakness. The army needed blood, a public answer to festering morale. Chain the boy to a mangonel and sling him over Chalus's walls. Flay him, hang him, quarter him, make an example. Every officer in that tent nodded, swords tapping armored thighs in grim agreement. Only Eleanor, standing half a pace behind, watched her son's profile with a stillness colder than stone. Richard's hand rose, slow, deliberate, silencing the council. He studied the child again, as if weighing the arrow all over. Then he spoke, each word a knife in his lungs. "Set him free." The tent hissed. A captain dropped his helmet. It rolled against a stool with a hollow ring that seemed, absurdly, to mark the death of strategy itself. "Sire?" the chamberlain croaked. "Unchain him," Richard repeated. "Give him a silver coin and send him home to his mother." Madness, everyone thought it. Fever must be gnawing his reason the way rot gnawed his flesh. The king had raved for days about crusades and caged lions. Now he was granting life to the archer who felled him. The guards hesitated until Eleanor's voice, quiet, razor-edged, cut the air. "You heard your king." Chains clattered. Iron slid from slender ankles. One cuff left a red ring that would bruise by morning. The boy, still stunned, didn't move. Richard gestured again, weaker. A purse of silver, only 3 coins, was pressed into the boy's trembling palm. The king watched, a strange light flickering behind the fever glaze. Compassion? Perhaps. Or the practical cruelty of letting guilt weigh heavier than any gallows. "Will you remember me?" Richard asked, almost playful. The boy's lip quivered. "Forever." "Then go," the king said. "Live long enough that the story tortures you." Eleanor closed her eyes, just once, as though acknowledging the paradox. Mercy wielded as punishment. The guards ushered the boy out, past ranks of soldiers whose hunger for vengeance curdled into confusion. Some spat in the dirt, others crossed themselves. No one dared strike him. By the time he reached the picket line, dawn was whitening the world, and birds, oblivious to thrones, chirped their small defiance of night. History, however, rarely tolerates loose ends. Days later, after Richard's last breath, after Eleanor's caravan rolled south, the boy was seized by mercenaries drunk on grief and empty pay chests. They tied him to a tree outside Chalus and flayed the thin back Richard had spared. No coin could bribe bloodlust cured too late. A listening priest wrote that the boy died praying for the king he'd killed, though scholars suspect the words were the priest's, not the boy's. So whose was the final mercy? The king's, offered from a mattress of infection, or the soldiers served on raw bark beneath indifferent stars? Chroniclers bickered. One called Richard saintly for forgiving, another labeled him irresponsible, letting sentiment poison justice. Modern minds lean toward fever-induced delirium. A ruler's brain simmered past strategy. And yet, somewhere in the foothills of Limousin, farmers still tell of a ghostly archer wandering fields at dusk, carrying 3 silver coins in an outstretched hand. In the tale, he searches eternally for the king's tent, desperate to give the money back, desperate to say thank you or sorry, before history's roar drowns him again. Mercy, madness, myth. Sometimes they share the same quiver. Picture a map unrolled across a candle-lit war table, its parchment belly buckling beneath wooden pins. In one version of history, the version that never breathes, England's red lions sprawl across not just the Channel, but deep into the emerald guts of Anjou, the vineyards of Touraine, the salt-white cliffs of Normandy, and south toward the warm belly of Aquitaine. A single crown commands both shores, the Atlantic murmuring obediently at its feet. That map existed for a heartbeat, exactly the space between a crossbow string's snap and the first drop of Richard's blood. Had the arrow flown wide, the 12th century would have faced a monarch fresh from crusade, pockets jingling with ransoms squeezed from German emperors, appetite sharpened by 6 years in Saracen dust. Richard had already begun stitching his continental holdings into something unprecedented, a bilingual, bi-coastal empire whose taxes would dwarf Paris, whose fleets could bottle the Mediterranean like cheap wine, whose soldiers, seasoned beneath Levant suns, would march as far as they could smell plunder. Consider the dragonflies of consequence. Philip Augustus of France, that silver-tongued spider, spent most mornings calculating how many castles he could nibble from Plantagenet lands before Richard galloped back from the Holy Land. If the Lionheart had lived, Philip's ambitions might have ended teeth first against English shields. Treaties would harden into shackles. French lords might trade lilies for lions, and the Capetian dream of a unified France could die whimpering in a ditch outside Rouen. The papacy, forever balancing crusade fervor against European brawls, hoped Richard would return east. A living Lionheart might have launched a new holy war, this time with siege towers paid by Anglo-Norman gold, crossbowmen fed on Gascon wine. Jerusalem, still bruised from Saladin's triumph, could have found itself clawed back under a crimson and gold standard. Latin kingdoms reborn, Greek emperors uneasy, Fatimid courtiers sharpening daggers in shadows thick with incense. And John? Poor, scheming, underloved John would have remained John Lackland in every mocking tavern song. No Magna Carta, because there'd be no desperate king to squeeze for rights. No baronial rebellion fattened by Richard's debts. England's long road to parliamentary limits might have detoured into a deep forest and never reappeared. But history, spiteful playwright, slammed that door the instant iron kissed flesh. When Richard died, the lost kingdom collapsed like a tent with its central pole kicked away. Norman counts, once glued by fear of the Lionheart's wrath, peeled off to flirt with Philip. Aquitanian bannermen weighed loyalty against the sweet clink of Capetian coins. English taxes that should have financed new fortresses floated instead toward royal funerals and mercenary arrears. Within 3 years, John would sign treaties ceding swaths of France he couldn't defend. Within 5, he'd lose Normandy entirely. Lands that had suckled Plantagenets for a century snapped off like burnt crust. In dusty chancery rooms, clerks scratched out his dominions on both sides of the sea and substituted grim little parish lists. Monastic scribes inked elegies for a bilingual empire, but the pages smelled of defeat, lamp oil, stale vellum, and a hint of mildew no illumination could disguise. The dream map curled in forgotten coffers, its once bold ink fading to the color of dried sorrow. Yet the phantom kingdom kept haunting corridors of power. When French kings bragged of new conquests, gray-haired knights muttered, "Not while Richard lived." When English merchants grumbled at tariffs in Bordeaux, they spat, "Wouldn't happen if the Lionheart still ruled." When crusaders faltered at Damietta, commanders whispered, "He'd have broken the Nile like a twig." Regret became currency. Every plague, famine, or lost skirmish was tallied against the debt of that single arrow. The peasant archer, nameless and long-rotted, earned footnote curses in chronicles. Because of him, France breathes. A crude graffiti in Rouen Cathedral showed a stick-figure boy loosing a bolt at a crowned lion, underneath the words, "Tant pis pour nous," too bad for us. But nostalgia is a slippery elixir, sip too much, and the present spoils on the tongue. In real cities of real mud, bakers still rose at dawn, hammering rye into loaves shaped like crowns. Smiths still quenched swords in urine-tainted water, cursing taxes no matter which king demanded them. Lovers still carved initials in monastery doorframes, praying not for empires but for safe childbirth and mild winters. The Lost Kingdom was exquisite precisely because it never had to exist. Perfect geometry drawn in vapor spared the indignities of budget shortfalls and scabbed harvests. What would it really have looked like? Perhaps a mosaic of accents, laws, and rivalries too fractious for any one banner to tame. Perhaps revolt would brew the moment Richard sailed south again, leaving John as caretaker, history's favorite miscalculation replayed. Maybe the Lionheart, flush with triumph, would raise taxes until English shires rioted harder than any French campaign could. Or maybe one more arrow, 1 inch lower, would still find its mark a year later, and the empire would crumble anyway, only with more dead stacked beneath it. But speculation is parchment smoke. Fact stands unclothed. A teenager's bolt birthed a France that could breathe, an England that would eventually invent habeas corpus, a papacy forced to broker crusades with kings less spectacular but more pliable. From the wound's black mouth poured Parliament, the 100 Years' War, Agincourt, Joan of Arc, Tudor propaganda, Shakespeare's history plays, and the modern idea that a nation could be both island and empire. All because one boy pulled a trigger on an April evening, and the arrow obeyed an angle older than destiny. Tonight, centuries later, if you unroll a map under low light, you might still hear parchment rustle with the echo of that lost kingdom, edges twitching toward one another like iron filings around a magnet that isn't there. Run a fingertip along the channel. Imagine the ink filling in, lions swaggering across provinces that today speak French, roads lined with milestones bearing an English king's Latin titles. Feel how easily the boundary blurs. Then blow out the candle and watch the phantom borders vanish, just as they did when a nameless arrow left its bow, and an empire history never truly earned bled out on the ground. Long before an anonymous bowman tumbled him into legend, Richard had already committed his gravest tactical sin. He loved the idea of war more than the work of ruling. His heart chased horizons, not hedgerows, holy lands, not home fronts. While he jousted with Saladin beneath a blistering Levantine sun, moss crept up the walls of his own fortresses back in France. Stone doesn't care for glory, it cares for mortar, and mortar needs money. Richard preferred trumpets. Picture him in 1191, bronze skin and dust-caked mail glittering on Acre's ramparts, eyes fixed eastward like an archangel on overtime. Behind him, messengers tried to thrust writs about Normandy's unpaid garrisons into his gauntlets. He waved them off. Later, I'm negotiating with God. By the time later arrived, God was busy elsewhere, and the garrisons had pawned their crossbow strings for bread. The empire Richard inherited resembled a sprawling estate run by caretakers who'd misplaced every key. Castles perched on chalk cliffs with cisterns cracked wide, watchtowers listing seaward like drunken monks. Royal stewards filed reports stuffed with phrases such as stocks exhausted, gatehouse timbers rotten, and most damning, masons on strike for lack of wages. Richard read none of it, or if he did, he bled red wax onto each parchment and scribbled, "Hold until my return." His return never truly happened. England saw him for fewer than 6 months of his 10-year reign, a monarch turning up like a comet that impressed everyone, scorched pockets, and vanished. When he did stroll through Westminster, the people lined streets not to cheer his policies, he had none, but to marvel at the walking myth. They tossed petals, he tossed scowls, Jerusalem still sprawled behind his eyelids, brighter than London's overcrowded quays. Meanwhile, back in Aquitaine, local nobles treated royal authority the way children treat unsupervised pantries. Toll gates multiplied on river crossings, wine tariffs doubled, petitions to Paris replaced appeals to Rouen. Philip Augustus, ever the opportunist, courted these barons with silk-gloved hands and iron-gloved soldiers. "Why starve under an absent lion," he purred, "when you could feast beneath a lily?" Quietly, castles once graced by English banners sprouted French fleur-de-lis like fungus after rain. Richard responded the only way he knew: siege. But each siege cost more coin, more supplies, more favors promised to mercenaries who spoke no language but silver clink. To fund them, he squeezed England until the island squealed. Taxes on wool, on windows, on widows. Bishops muttered that Christ might charge less for salvation. When the king was captured en route from crusade and ransomed for 150,000 marks, the realm coughed up its last ounce of goodwill. Plate melted from abbey altars, chalices stripped of gems, peasants' teeth pried to weigh in goldsmiths' scales. They paid, he rode free, and still the castles crumbled. One could argue Richard never noticed the decay because he never stopped moving. Campaign seasons blurred, the Loire Valley in spring drizzle, Pyrenean passes in summer dust, the Rhine's gray breath come autumn. Each stop he marked by ordering another wall breached, another treasurer bankrupted, another troubadour commissioned to sing of wars his subjects would only fund, never see. His worldview reduced to two categories: fortresses that resisted him and fortresses not yet built tall enough to resist him. Even his mother, Eleanor, scolded him in letters. "What use is winning Jerusalem if Gascony starves?" He replied with gifts: perfume vials from Acre, pearls he'd ripped from Byzantine idols, tokens as hollow as the keep walls sagging back home. She sighed, stored the trinkets, and hired more masons herself, paying with her own dwindling dower. Queens fix roofs while kings chase sunsets. And John, obsequious, overlooked John, learned from the negligence. While Richard battered Saracens, John toured English shires, promising fair justice in exchange for unguarded keys. Sheriffs swore loyalty to the brother who showed up. By the time Richard limped home, arrow wounds oozing stories, John had a network of favor thicker than any castle wall. Betrayal, like mold, thrives where maintenance fails. So when that fateful spring of 1199 rolled around, Richard stood before Chalus-Chabrol, believing one last petty siege would remind Aquitaine who paid the masons. He laughed at the shabby ramparts, confident a few days of intimidation would scare gold out of peasant hiding holes. He never considered that the fortress he truly needed to shore up was himself, his flesh, thin armor against infection, his realm, thin veneer against revolt. The crossbow bolt that found his armpit merely slipped through gaps he'd been leaving open for a decade. After his death, chroniclers retrofitted wisdom into the narrative, calling him Anvil of the Capetians, Hammer of the Infidel, Paragon of Chivalry. But in cold ledgers, auditors wrote simpler obituaries: revenues depleted, walls unrepaired, garrisons unpaid. Richard's legend survived because parchment loves drama, while stone demands rent. Centuries later, tourists strolling ruined Angevin keeps often marvel at wind-carved battlements and ivy-strangled gates. They speak of romantic decay, of ghosts whispering under moonlit merlins. Yet if you listen beyond the poets, you might hear something plainer. The hollow clack of a treasury chest opened too many times, the sigh of mortar ignored. Richard left songs enough to echo through ages, but a castle can't be held by echo. He was, in the end, a crusader who forgot that an empire is a castle whose walls never finish rising. The moment you stop laying stones, weeds claim the cracks and arrows find their way through. Richard Plantagenet began draining the treasury the moment his heartbeat quit, and the bills have never truly closed. Instead of one clean grave, he required 3. His heart whisked north to Rouen in a silver casket padded with spices, his entrails salted and entombed at Chalus to placate the villagers who'd watched him rot, and the rest of him hauled 400 kilometers south to Fontevraud Abbey, wrapped in so many layers of waxed cloth that the coffin looked like a siege tower in mourning. Every mile cost coin, bribes at toll gates, wages for coffin bearers, trumpeters, banner makers, candlemongers, brewers, cooks, an entire traveling economy orbiting a body that leaked whenever the cart hit a rut. The perfume bill alone could have funded a modest castle. Apothecaries emptied shelves of balsam, aloe, myrrh, and ambergris, whale vomit rarer than rubies, trying to drown the smell of 6-day rot. Monks burned beeswax candles from Flanders so pure they glowed like high noon, and they melted faster than grief, each puddle another entry in the royal ledger. Yet no aroma could mask the larger stink: debt. Richard had died owing ransoms to emperors, back pay to mercenaries, and loans to Templars. Creditors descended like flies, insisting on full settlement before a single requiem was sung. One German envoy demanded interest calculated to the minute of Richard's captivity. A Venetian shipbuilder produced a half-finished galley contract and requested payment in advance for timbers already warped by lagoon damp. Relic hunters smelled opportunity too. Rogue monks chiseled splinters from the coffin, selling them on pilgrimage routes as fragments of the arrow that felled the Lionheart. By 1210, the market value of dubious Richard memorabilia rivaled England's annual coinage, and royal officials had to post guards around a corpse no longer capable of defending itself. Hidden costs multiplied elsewhere. Peasants neglected spring planting to build roadside shrines, shrinking the harvest and therefore the tax base. Coastal dikes in Normandy went unrepaired because masons were carving Latin epitaphs, and autumn storms later flooded barley fields the crown had to subsidize. Centuries passed, the spending rolled on. Alchemists in the Renaissance pried open Rouen silver urns seeking elixirs, wrecked the container, and charged the city for research materials. Revolutionary looters left the shriveled heart in place. No melt value, lingering odor, possible curse. But the town had to pay guards anyway. In 2013, scientists X-rayed the dusty relic, confirming traces of mint, frankincense, and mercury. The study cost €80,000 in grants and lab fees, proof that Richard still invoices posterity. One modern historian ventured a tally. The immediate and cascading expenses of Richard's death consumed roughly 2% of Plantagenet GDP across 30 years, enough to fund 2 crusades, 3 cathedrals, or, with cruel irony, the fortress repairs that might have kept France at bay after him. So when tourists gaze at the alabaster effigy in Fontevraud, lion at his feet, stone sword on marble mail, they see only the visible peak of an iceberg minted in silver, sweat, candle smoke, and centuries of compound interest. That is the final tax on glory. When a king spends his life buying songs instead of solvency, the world keeps paying for the echo. The rumor began like most medieval fantasies, with a drunk monk and a badly translated scrap of Roman gossip. Someone claimed Julius Caesar had marched through Limousin 2 centuries before Christ and buried wagon loads of imperial gold beneath the rocky knoll of Chalus-Chabrol. No map, no inscription, just a half-remembered line about treasure beyond counting, whispered beside a tavern hearth. By the time the tale reached Richard's hawkish ears, Caesar's coins had multiplied into mountains, emerald-studded scepters, even a bronze she-wolf that howled at new moons. The Lionheart, drowning in crusade debts yet still addicted to spectacle, decided a minor detour was worth the gamble. He imagined catapults prying open stone walls the way a jeweler lifts a lid from a casket overflowing with ori. He pictured paying off emperors, repurchasing Normandy's loyalty, perhaps even commissioning a fleet to retake Jerusalem, each galley christened with Caesar's windfall. What he never pictured were the pigs. Chalus, it turned out, was less a fortress than an overgrown pig pen squatting on a limestone ridge. Its lord, Aymar de Limoges, owned more hogs than horses. The animals wandered in and out of the bailey, crunching acorns, snorting through refuse, and fertilizing the muddy yard with a zeal that stained every boot within minutes. Yet it was precisely these rooting snouts that had birthed the gold legend. Peasants often unearthed odd Roman trinkets, a rusted coin here, a broken clasp there, while digging for truffles. Each relic fed the fire until the countryside glowed with greed. When Richard's banner appeared on the horizon, villagers wagered pork shoulders on how long their ridiculous walls could hold. The king arrived trailing siege engines taller than bell towers, and an army so hungry for pay they would have eaten the pigs raw if discipline slipped for a heartbeat. He ordered the castle ringed, trenches dug and ladders raised, all while flies buzzed ecstatic over troop latrines and pigsty runoff mingled in the spring air. The defenders, fewer than 50 and armed with little more than stubbornness, jeered from the battlements. They waved pig bladders inflated like balloons, squealing them in mock salute. Richard, who had weathered the desert heat of Ascalon, found the country stench personally insulting. He would seize the treasure and, as a favor to God, burn every sty to purify the land. Except treasure hunts have a way of replacing logic with obsession. For 11 days, the king's men hurled stones, shot quarrels, and hacked at a gate so rotten it might have surrendered to a stern lecture. Yet whenever a breach seemed imminent, Richard ordered the attack paused, demanding prisoners reveal the exact location of Caesar's hoard. The captives shrugged, explaining between teeth-rattling threats that the only gold they'd seen was the color of their pigs' straw-flecked dung. The more they denied, the more certain Richard became they were hiding something monumental. Local folklore claims the Lord of Chalus tried to buy peace with a chest of copper coins coated in beeswax and powdered saffron to mimic gold's glint. He supposedly presented it with a bow, assuring the king these were all that remained of Caesar's bounty. Richard laughed, then smashed the chest with a mace, sending false florins skittering like startled beetles across the courtyard. The pigs trotted after them, sniffing, deciding the coins tasted no worse than cabbage stems. Watching swine nose counterfeit riches into the mud should have been omen enough, but pride is louder than prophecy. Richard persisted until a lone crossbow bolt hissed from a crenel, skipped the rim of his shield, and found the soft seam beneath his arm. After the king fell back to camp, fevered and cursing, treasure fever infected the ranks. Soldiers scoured every thicket for hidden shafts and goat tracks that might lead to secret vaults. They overturned pigsties, ransacked bee sheds, even dismantled a tiny chapel stone by stone, looking for hollow niches. All they uncovered were trampled mushrooms, worm-eaten icons, and one terrified sow that gave birth mid-search, scattering squealing piglets under charging boots. It was the only new wealth produced during the entire siege. When Richard finally died, the rumor of Caesar's gold refused to perish with him. John, ever opportunistic, dispatched agents to shake down Chalus yet again, but they returned with nothing except a tooth-marked pewter spoon a pig had swallowed and excreted, now polished and presented as Roman silver. Philip Augustus, smelling opportunity, floated tales that the treasure actually lay under nearby Montbrun, luring English resources away while he consolidated lands Richard had neglected. Meanwhile, roving bandits adopted the legend to justify looting farmsteads. "We seek the king's lost fortune," they'd claim, clubbing peasants unconscious for a cracked amphora that once held olive oil. Centuries later, antiquarians armed with shovels and Latin dictionaries descended on Limousin hills, chasing every whisper of imperial coinage. They dug trenches that scarred meadows, catalogued potsherds, and occasionally discovered rusted boar spears. One Victorian enthusiast exhumed a pig skull, convinced it was the helm of a Roman standard-bearer. He shipped it to London, where experts identified pig, returned it with a polite note, and the man promptly labeled it Sus Scrofa, legionary mascot. The treasure eluded them all, slipping into the realm of fairy silver, valuable precisely because proof would ruin the story. Modern archaeologists now suspect Caesar never marched through Chalus at all. The scattered Roman coins likely dropped from traders' purses centuries after the conquest of Gaul. The hoard existed only in the minds of villagers desperate for luck and kings desperate for cash. But facts seldom dent legend. Stand in the courtyard ruins today, and locals will still point at a collapsed corner keep and swear that beneath its mossy stones lies a staircase corkscrewing into a cavern of untouched bullion. They'll tell you pigs, descendants of those that mocked Richard, avoid the spot, as if sworn to protect imperial secrets. Tourists laugh, take photos, and check the earth for a gleam of metal when no one's looking, because greed, like rust, never sleeps. So the final irony holds. The Lionheart bled out chasing gold that never existed, dying in a place whose real wealth was pork. His armies marched home poorer than they arrived, his kingdom fractured under debts treasure might have cured, and Chalus remains a tourist dot on the map, selling refrigerator magnets shaped like pigs. Somewhere in Limousin's soil, perhaps, one last Roman coin still waits, that lone survivor of a rumor sharp enough to kill a king. But if you dig for it, mind the pigs. They remember whose legend fertilized their ancestors' mud, and they bite. If Richard had owned a sliver of clean wood the width of a fingernail, nothing more glorious than the utensil tavern keepers used to pry mutton from their molars, he might have outlived the fever that carried him off. That sounds absurd, almost insulting to a man who could crack a Saracen shield with one swing. But infection cares nothing for heroics. It respects hygiene, a virtue his age dismissed as foreign sorcery. In the weeks before Chalus, he had chewed greasy venison on campaign roads, let strands of salted pork hang between teeth, and slept in mail crusted with last season's sweat. Each sunrise found him spitting tartar too old to remember its first battle. A toothpick, sharpened smooth and dabbed in wine, could have flicked away the invisible colonies that waited for the slightest nick in his gums. Colonies that, once in the bloodstream, treated his arteries like new pilgrimage routes. He should have known better. During the Crusade, he'd watched Byzantine officers rinse mouths with vinegar after every meal. They claimed it kept the black humors from nesting beneath the tongue. Richard had laughed at their daintiness, then bellowed orders with breath that smelled of dried goat fat and clove. Yet those same officers, fastidious and perfumed, survived dysentery seasons that killed men twice their stature. Richard believed their survival came from weak constitutions, unused to English hardships. The truth was smaller, almost invisible, microorganisms hitching rides on food scraps and blunted arrowheads waiting for soft tissue to pierce. When the crossbow bolt slid under his arm, the shaft was filthy, feathers damp, iron head mottled with barn rust. The physical wound might have sealed had his blood not already teemed with the bacteria nurtured in his own mouth. Surgeons saw only a puncture turning dark. They poured warm lard across it, sealing infection inside like a demon under melted wax. A simple rinse of boiled water, no, even better, a toothpick dipped in salt, could have reduced the microbial charge to something his immune system might contest. Instead, the blood gorged itself on invaders, and every heartbeat spread the siege deeper than any French catapult could dream. Medieval chroniclers blamed corrupted air, claiming Limousin marsh vapors poisoned the king. They never looked at the smoked beef fibers stuck between his molars, absorbing saliva, feeding streptococcus. One monk, tasked with washing Richard's corpse, recorded that the gums were blackened as though burned. In his marginalia, he wondered aloud if Satan had kissed the king to claim his soul. Satan, in that case, wore the disguise of dental plaque. The irony is that toothpicks were everywhere. Peasants snapped hawthorn twigs after supper. Moorish traders carried silver ones etched with verses. Apothecaries sold mint-coated sticks for a penny beside their leeches. Richard could have afforded a cartload, but court fashion considered visible grooming effeminate. A warrior showed gaps in his grin like medals. He polished sword pommels, never incisors. Even Eleanor, pragmatic as drought, failed to persuade her sons that health sometimes hides in habits too small for ballads. There exists a single account of Richard using a makeshift toothpick. During the siege of Acre, he whittled a cedar splinter while lecturing knights on courage. A squire noted the king flicking out a sliver of lamb gristle before tossing the wood aside. That fleeting gesture, had it become routine, might have altered the map of Europe. Because if the bloodstream had met the crossbow bacteria on equal terms, half strength, harassed by salt and wine, perhaps the rot would have slowed, perhaps the fever would have passed, perhaps the Lionheart would have healed with a puckered scar and another boast for campfires. John would have remained landless, Philip Augustus checkmated, and Normandy's walls repaired with the ransom coins never spent on embalming herbs. Modern labs prove the point. In 1928, a French microbiologist exhumed scrapings from the linen that wrapped Richard's chest, cultured them, and identified strains of Streptococcus mutans mixed with soil-borne Clostridium. The oral bacteria outnumbered the environmental spores 3-1. He published a paper proposing that poor dental hygiene primed the fatal septicemia. Academics scoffed. Too mundane an explanation for a Crusader king's demise, but subsequent DNA sequencing in 2017 confirmed the ratio. There, in petri dishes glowing under fluorescent lights, Richard's ghost whispered that an empire's fate sometimes balances on food remnants no thicker than a thumbnail. So picture him on that final evening, campfires snapping outside the royal tent. A servant approaches with wine. Another sets a platter of pork ribs on a battered chest. Richard tears flesh from bone, wipes grease across his beard, then dismisses attendants eager to scrape the leftovers. Had one lingered, offered a slender pine splint with a respectful bow, the king might have cleaned the crevice where tomorrow's fever already brewed. He might have felt the sharp wood dislodge a clot of meat, tasted iron tang mixed with resin, and, because vanity ever shadowed him, spat into the grass before tossing the pick aside. In that single, unremarkable flick of the wrist, Europe's destiny could have pivoted. Instead, the pick never came. The meat stayed lodged, the bacteria bred, and when steel kissed skin under the lamplit battlements of Chalus, the invaders were ready, armies within an artery, marching unopposed. Steel did not kill the Lionheart. Neglect did. Neglect of a tool small enough to tuck behind an ear. A monarch felled by absence, by the refusal to admit that greatness lives and dies in details no herald will paint on a shield. The next time you slide a wooden shard between your teeth after supper, feel history balancing on that pressure point. Hear the faint echo of hooves in Limousin dusk, the rasp of chainmail, the gasp of a king discovering that mortality often slips in not with an arrow, but with yesterday's dinner. John woke to crows arguing on the gallows beam outside the inn, a sound like rusted hinges grinding gossip. He had gambled late, drunk deeper than sense, and dreamed of nothing grander than a pile of silver to quiet his creditors. Now a courier in mud-flecked livery banged on the door and shoved a sealed strip of parchment into his hands. The wax still felt warm. He broke it, expecting another demand he could not satisfy, and instead found 6 Latin words that rearranged his bones. Rex frater tuus, ultimum spiritum expiravit. Your royal brother has breathed his last. The room wobbled, Ale churned. John pressed a palm to the table as if steadying the earth. For a heartbeat, he saw himself mirrored in a puddle of stale wine, red-eyed, whiskered, nobody's idea of destiny, and wondered who had misdelivered such a letter. Then he remembered the stink of politics. Sometimes messages were true precisely when you prayed they were jokes. He left the inn, still lacing his boots, sword rattling loose in a scabbard nicked from pawn. The crows flapped upward, startled, black confetti scattering over the courtyard. Somewhere across the channel, barons were already sharpening quills and daggers, scribbling fresh loyalties, weighing the merits of a boy named Arthur against the shortcomings of a man called Lackland. John spat, tasted last night's sour wine, and ordered his horse. A crown might sit awkwardly, but it was better than a noose woven from unpaid debts. Riding north, he felt the English autumn seep through seams in his cloak. Fields lay stubbled, geese scribbled south across pewter skies, and every milestone seemed to whisper Richard's name in receding echoes. John tried shouting over those echoes with thoughts of accounting, what ports still owed fees, which sheriffs were pliable, how many tins of coin he could scrape before Philip Augustus pounced. Math steadied him. Numbers demanded neither courage nor charisma. Yet under the arithmetic pulsed an older, hungrier rhythm. You were never meant to wear the lion. He remembered childhood feasts where Richard boasted of crusades between bites of dripping roast, Geoffrey plotted heraldry on scraps of bread, and Henry the young king rehearsed coronations with borrowed crowns. John, too small, too late, played at jester because someone had to make the lords laugh. Now the jest had turned on its tongue. He pushed the horse harder. Mud flew, hoofbeats drummed like impatient verdicts, and wind folded his cloak into a banner nobody saluted. At dusk, the road climbed a ridge. Beyond it sprawled Rouen, cathedral spire piercing clouds, bells tolling for the brother whose heart lay pickling inside. John reined in at the crest, breathing steam. Below, lamps blinked along quays like cautious eyes. Somewhere among them waited the Great Seal of England, crown jewels, regalia heavy enough to drown a man if he wore them wrong. The welcome was colder than November rain. Eleanor, wrapped in mourning black that made her seem carved from shadow, met him in the cathedral nave. Incense coiled around her like smoke, longing for a chimney. She did not smile. She simply touched 2 fingers to the silver urn containing Richard's heart and said, "Kneel, swear." The command cut deeper than maternal concern. It sounded like a final test she expected him to fail. John knelt, palms sweating. Candles hissed. He swore by saints he hardly trusted, his voice rattling in Gothic vaults. Eleanor watched, hawk still, until the oath ended. Then she placed the royal ring on a cushion, not his finger, and whispered, "Rule or be ruled. There is no middle." She turned, skirts whispering like pages turning on a story already written past its hero. Crowning took place in Westminster weeks later, but the war for legitimacy began the moment he left the nave. Loyalists rushed to kiss his hand. Skeptics sniffed for the scent of fraud. Mercenaries discussed daily rates louder than hymns. News sprinted ahead of him, carried by riders faster than ravens. Arthur gathers support in Brittany. Philip promises protection. Barons in Anjou demand guarantees. Each report hammered his temples. John responded like a man plugging leaks in a barrel hammered thin by better craftsmen. He promised low taxes in Norwich, raised them in Exeter, pardoned thieves in Kent, hanged poachers in Sussex. He wrote charters at dawn, revoked them by dusk, and hired scribes to catalog decrees he himself could not track. Coins clinked out of treasuries, never quite loud enough to drown the rumors that he had starved his nephew's claim, that he had bribed Eleanor, that Richard's real heir was buried in some secret monastery awaiting divine timing. In private, he practiced kingliness before a dingy mirror, tilting his chin the way Richard had, narrowing eyes into a glare meant to subdue squires. The reflection refused majesty. It showed a man gaunt with caution, beard uneven from hurried trimming, lips tightened around words he feared might crack if spoken too boldly. He smashed the mirror, regretted the expense, and ordered another. Winter rolled across the realm. Frost gripped courtyards, mortar cracked, and John discovered just how drafty a throne room could be once the fires dimmed. Advisors bickered over blankets of authority, each tug exposing a different corner of his naked uncertainty. He learned to smile thinly, to nod without pledging, to feign melodies of command while the tune still eluded him. One night, unable to sleep, he slipped alone into the treasury, flanked by silent chests welded shut since Henry II. He pried one open, half expecting it to be empty, and found stacks of ransom coins Richard had never spent. Gold glinted like captured sunlight, hard and accusing. John dipped both hands into the pile, feeling the cold discs bite his skin. He thought of roads needing repair, castles needing garrisons, allies needing gifts, of everything his brother had neglected for glory, and felt a surge of something close to purpose. Not honor, certainly not piety, but steel-edged resolve. He would wield coin the way Richard wielded swords. He ordered the money weighed, melted, recast into smaller ingots, portable promises that could travel faster than armies. Some called it prudence, others called it the beginning of England's fiscal choking. Either way, it was John's first unmistakable imprint on a kingdom still damp with his brother's legend. Morning found him at the window, watching snowflakes settle on the courtyard like quiet ultimatums. A stable hand below slipped, scattering straw. The horse sniffed, unconcerned. John wondered if that was what kingship truly was, maintaining poise while the ground kept sliding. He closed the shutters, summoned clerks, and began dictating orders for a reign that had no script, only consequences. Out in the snow, 2 crows flapped down to peck at spilled grain, black coats over a white page. John turned away before they could remind him of the gallows beam, the inn, and the letter that had delivered both fortune and burden in a single wax-sealed breath. A king, he decided, lives by forgetting what the birds already know, that accidents can crown as easily as they can kill, and that every crown is merely an accident waiting to happen. It began with a silence so complete that London's dawn bells sounded like distant gossip, scarcely real. The capital woke expecting thunder, of trumpets, of hoofbeats, of proclamation, but met only the soft scrape of shutters opening onto an ordinary sky. Then a single herald rode across London Bridge, banner drooping, mouth thin as a paper cut. His horse's shoes struck the timber with slow, ceremonial clacks, each one a punctuation mark in a sentence people had not yet learned to dread. He announced nothing. The square announced him. By the time he dismounted at St. Paul's, rumor had sprinted ahead. Richard was gone. News had seeped through countryside lanes for weeks, but cities devoured certainty. Burghers craved it like pepper. Apprentices traded it like dice. And now certainty arrived, liveried in black and dust to claim its price. Shopkeepers pulled awnings low. Butchers paused their saws. A fishmonger crossed himself, the wet scales of a pike reflecting a future suddenly murky. Somewhere a child asked why the grown-ups were whispering. No one answered. Children remember tone, not words, and the tone said that stories ending in castles and crusades could also end in ditches and fever. In Westminster Hall, officials arranged benches into a corridor of grief. The royal standard, gules, 3 gold lions passant, was lowered to half-staff, folding lions into themselves like wounded beasts. Clerks unfurled scrolls listing protocols, toll bell, 99 times, remove the king's name from daily prayers, draft letters to every shire reeve. Quills scratched, sand scattered, wax melted. Each bureaucratic gesture tried to trap loss in neat lines, yet everywhere the ink dried, it left a bloom that looked suspiciously like a bruise. The vacuum Richard left was practical before it was poetic. Sailors stood idle at Woolwich. Cargoes of Aquitanian wine awaited custom stamps that bore the late king's seal, unfit now to strike duty marks. Carters queued at Aldgate with barrels of saltfish turning beneath covered tarps. Without fresh warrants, the gates would not open, and brine could not buy patience forever. Even plague knew a window when it saw one. Rats fattened in storehouses that normally emptied quickly under Richard's martial appetite. A realm paused can rot faster than flesh, and yet grief is a double-edged plow. Every furrow it carves can sprout ambition. By midday, rooftops bristled with watchers trailing gossip like pennons. "John means taxes," said a washerwoman wringing linens stiffer than her hopes. "Arthur means war," countered a cooper, hammering hoops onto a barrel he might never sell if tariffs changed overnight. Not one name sounded like safety. The city smelled of tallow smoke and speculative dread. At Vespers, monks in Westminster draped the choir with black cloth so thick it muted echoes. They chanted Miserere mei, Deus, their voices slipping between pillars like candle wax down stone. Outside, a fog rolled off the Thames, muffling footsteps, blurring torches, turning men into torchlit ghosts. The fog felt ordained, as though nature herself conspired to erase outlines until England recolored them under a new hand. That same hour, John rode through Sussex heaths, beneath a sky bruised with twilight, telling himself he felt no fear. But fear rode pillion, of barons who admired lion roar, of French schemes clawing at Normandy, of a treasury already whispering of scarcity. He rehearsed words for his coronation, words that must transform a lifelong understudy into a leading man. Each phrase wilted when he imagined Richard's booming version. He kicked his horse harder. Back in London, taverns filled with citizens who refused to go home because lamplight and ale seemed like the last ramparts against uncertainty. They toasted the Lionheart in solemn draughts, banging mugs that left rings on scarred tables, rings that would outlast lamentations once the ale dried. Ballad singers tested new verses, some heroic, some sly, a few skeptical. One daring jongleur murmured that a lion's death leaves room for foxes. He collected fewer coins than insults, but the lyric would survive. passed from mouth to mouth, softening each retelling until it became wisdom. Past midnight, the bells of St. Mary Le Bow tolled their 99th chime, the iron throat of the city coughing finality into cold air, streets emptied as if on command. In an alley behind the Guildhall, 3 apprentices carved a quick lion into soft mortar, then drew a line through it, a blunt epitaph that mortar would remember longer than parchment. On Cheapside, a baker stacked unsold loaves and whispered to his wife that tomorrow the price of flour might double. They agreed to wake early. Kingdoms fallen make hungry crowds. And somewhere in the sprawl of tenements by the river, a widow who sold thread by the yard knelt beside her straw pallet and thanked God. She had lost 2 sons to Richard's ransom tax. She could not afford another crusade. Her prayer, inaudible beneath dripping eaves, joined 100 others, pleas not for glory but for peace, for roofs that didn't leak, for winters that passed gently. History rarely records such prayers, yet they are the soil in which new rains sink or stand. Dawn broke thin and coppery, brushing frost off thatched roofs. The city exhaled a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Hawkers set up stalls, masons struck chisels, scribes hurried along Thames Street carrying fresh commissions that began for the first time Johannes de Gracia Rex Angliae. The lion was gone, but the hunger of daily life returned, tireless, indifferent, unstoppable. Pigeons fluttered up from the parapets of White Tower, circled once and settled again, proof that even castles merely blink when kings pass. By noon, John's heralds would arrive, trumpets brassy, proclamations crisp. The crown would transfer, ceremonies would unfold, and London would pretend continuity where rupture still gaped. But in that hush between dynasties, those few fragile hours after Richard's 9th toll, and before John's first decree, England truly felt its pulse falter, aware with shocking clarity that crowns are only heavier versions of dust, that legacies can vanish like smoke through arrow slits, and that the silence left by a lion's last heartbeat can be the loudest sound a kingdom ever hears. The arrow hole in Richard's armpit never closed, not in flesh, nor in memory. Long after his bones settled beneath Fontevraud's vaults, scribes kept describing its color, its scent, its slow betrayal. They copied each other like fevered mirrors, turning a suppurating cavity into a passageway through which entire generations would peer at death. One monk in Canterbury claimed the wound wept every Good Friday, a crimson dew soaking the royal effigy. Pilgrims knelt, pressed lips to the cold stone, and swore they smelled vinegar and rot where there should have been nothing but dust and beeswax. The abbey denied it, then quietly stationed novices with scented tapers beside the tomb each Easter tide. In Paris, scholastic clerks debated whether Richard's gangrene had been divine punishment for broken crusader vows or simply the wages of mortal hubris. They penned disputations dense as briar thickets, citing Galen on putrefaction, Augustine on pride, and eyewitness rolls that grew more lurid with every retelling. By the time those parchments crossed the Alps, the king's skin was said to have sloughed off in wet sheets, revealing muscles that shone like salted pork. Italian preachers borrowed the image for sermons against vanity. See how even a lion melts when the Maker withdraws his mercy. Congregations gagged, then donated alms to hospitals for the poor, anything to buy distance from such a fate. Artists joined the contagion. In a Florentine marginalia of the Ars Moriendi, a miniature shows a crown sliding from a bloated corpse, flies dotting the purple mantle. The caption, Rex putruit dum superbia florabat, the king rotted while his pride blossomed. The painter had never left Tuscany, but the stink reached him across mountains, carried on gossip sweeter than spice caravans. He dotted his flies with gold leaf to catch the candlelight. Decay sold better when it glittered. Poets, sensing rich soil for irony, carved verses sharp enough to lance boils. A troubadour in Provence rhymed lion with pigeon, mocking how quickly glory turned to carrion once flesh tore. His refrain became tavern chorus, better a live pigeon than a dead lion reeking. Sailors hummed it while tar caulked their fingernails, and the phrase slipped into port slang, shorthand for any swaggering captain whose ship sat worm-eaten at dock. Dante, mapping hell, heard these echoes and assigned Richard a brief, blistering cameo. In the Purgatorio he passes a shade whose breast steams yet with canker, a warrior king chastened by the weight of his unconfessed pride. Scholars still squabble whether the reference is explicit, but early glossators drew a tiny lion beside the line, just in case anyone missed the roar beneath the verse. Meanwhile, physicians treated the story like a cadaver table. In Salerno's medical school, lecturers used the royal abscess to illustrate septicemia. Apprentices crowded round a wax effigy, poking holes and drizzling spoiled wine to mimic pus. They argued whether cautery should precede lancing, whether wine of Hippocras healed or harmed, whether prayers to Saint Blay could outpace bacteria none of them could see. Each demonstration ended with the same moral: clean the wound, or watch the patient disappear inside it. Yet the wound proved too profitable to clean. Relic dealers hawked cloths stained by the king's corruption, reddish smears painted on linen with sheep's blood thickened in vinegar. Charlatans sold vials of Lionheart ichor, promising it cured cowardice. Most were watered honey laced with ginger, fiery enough to make the gullible believe something powerful was happening inside their chests. Even universities could not resist. A Parisian master wrote that a minute particle of the royal gangrene, properly diluted, might inoculate soldiers against fear, an idea half alchemy, half whispered future science. He never produced the particle, but the speculation alone earned him patrons. Centuries turned, empires rose, plagues cycled, and still the whole gaped in manuscript after manuscript. Renaissance anatomists, chasing the flower of knowledge, exhumed the abbey's registry and requested permission to inspect what remained. The monks refused. They claimed the king's body was too fragile for inquiry, but really, they feared stripping the tomb of its mystery. A relic examined is a relic diminished. Better to let imagination foul the air than risk dispelling a scent lucrative in pilgrim coin. When handwriting yielded to print, the infection found new hosts. Broadsheets in London reprinted medieval chronicles, adding woodcuts of a monarch festering beneath quilted tents. The public, newly literate and already morbid, devoured the story between accounts of plague mortality and comets foretelling doom. A pamphleteer dedicated an entire issue to the gangrenous example of King Richard, advising readers to bathe twice yearly and avoid pork left overnight. Advice bold enough to brand him eccentric, practical enough to keep him in profit. In 1792, during revolutionary fervor, a mob stormed Rouen Cathedral seeking gold in tombs. They shattered statues, pried open niches, then gagged at the smell of stale resin. Someone cracked the heart reliquary, powder puffed out, gritty and brown. A rag soaked in cheap brandy kept the looters from vomiting, but they fled before prying further, convinced they'd stirred a curse. The reliquary lay dented among candle stubs until a priest smuggled it to safety. Even desecration could not finish the wound, it simply aerosolized the tale, floating anew in Jacobin clubs as caution against regal decay. Modern science finally pried the legend onto a microscope slide. In 2013, forensic teams analyzed the heart dust, traces of frankincense, myrtle, lime, mercury chloride. The report concluded Richard's embalmers had thrown every costly preservative at the rot, a chemical litany of desperation. Newspapers ran with headlines about the world's first royal autopsy, but readers still fixated on the smell, that medieval perfume of pus and myrrh. No peer-reviewed data could neutralize it. Thus, the wound endures, a lesion stitched into Europe's cultural skin. Kings have died bloodier deaths, many ruled longer, sinned harder, repented louder. Yet none left so persistent an abscess on the imagination. The arrow parted flesh. Infection expanded the gap. Storytellers kept it open, irrigating it with fear, faith, disgust, and fascination. Even now, speak Richard's name in a quiet library and see if books about crusading glories don't slide aside, offering instead a glimpse of blackened tissue, flies, and the reminder that glory's underside is soft and easily pierced. Somewhere among the oak-clad ridges of the Limousin, a smith's hammer clanged in rhythm with the sparrows. No records reveal his name. Parish rolls skipped over artisans who could not pay for Latin letters beside their birth. Yet one evening in early spring 1199, he drew a glowing strip of iron from his hearth and struck it until it narrowed into a vicious, leaf-shaped point. Sparks flew, hissed in damp air, and died unseen. Small fireworks celebrating a moment nobody marked. That arrowhead, cooled in a bucket the color of old blood, would travel scarcely 5 miles before rewriting European history. He was not the master of a grand forge, just a village bladesmith who sharpened plowshares when the soil thawed and re-rimmed wagon wheels when armies rumbled past. His clientele were peasants too poor for swords, hunters who bartered rabbit pelts, a reeve who demanded 6 new scythe blades each harvest. The king's levy on iron made every bar a gamble. Still, the smith bought enough to keep embers hungry. He measured wealth in bushels of rye, in jars of lard, in the sturdiness of his children's shoes. If he dreamed at night, it was perhaps of a roof that did not leak into the sleeping loft. Yet iron has its own dream, to fly, and crossbow bolts paid better than sickles. So when a lanky lad from Chalus slapped 2 coins on the anvil, one tarnished silver denier, one cut halfpenny, and asked for a dozen sharp, true quarrels, the smith did not hesitate. He heated billets, hammered thin, folded, and hammered again, chasing impurities toward the tip until they blinked away in bright specks. He eyeballed each point for symmetry, trimmed ragged edges with shears he'd inherited from a father who had fought for Henry II, then slotted the cooled heads into a trough of goose fat that kept rust at bay. No seal of quality, no maker's mark, only the bite of his file along the barb, a private signature few would notice. While the heads cooled, his wife and daughter whittled shafts from dogwood saplings, their small knives singing a softer counterpoint to the hammer's anthem. The boy, barefoot, cheeks mottled with sun and hunger, leaned against a post, watching. Perhaps he imagined heroic shots from romance tales, a single bolt loosed at a lord's ransom of stags, or a lucky hit on a marauding wolf. He never said. When the fletching was done, crow feathers bound with thread from an unraveled jerkin sleeve, the smith slid the dozen quarrels into a goatskin quiver, accepted the final coin, and wished the youngster good aim. They did not shake hands. Craftsmen kept soot to themselves. Days later, Richard Plantagenet stood below a crenel of Chalus Chabrol, mocking defenders with jeers learned in Levantine camps. A shaft hissed from those very stones, flew truer than the shooter's birthright should allow, and struck the gap at the king's armpit, just where chainmail sagged between pauldron and hauberk. The iron head's split skin, nicked vein, lodged deep. At that instant, the smith's life's work intersected an empire's fault line. He was not there to witness the impact, nor the gasp among onlookers, nor the slow-building panic that would rot a monarch from the inside. But destiny, indifferent to bylines, stamped his anonymous craftsmanship onto royal tissue. News of Richard's death spread outward like rings in water. It lapped at Limoges taverns first, a king felled by a peasant lad, bolt forged, somewhere nearby, surely by old so-and-so. The smith's neighbors traded guesses. One claimed the feathers looked like the ones he'd sold last Easter. Another swore the barb pattern matched his file strokes. The smith shrugged, hammering a cauldron rim, and let rumor pass. Admitting guilt, if guilt it was, meant inquiries, back taxes, maybe a noose. Silence weighed less than renown. But silence could not smother consequence. Within a week, royal patrols swept villages, inspecting forges for unlicensed war materiel. They measured stockpiles, levied fines, seized iron. The smith lost 2 bars, winter income, while soldiers tallied eggs from his hen coop as provisions. A sergeant fingered the smith's anvil, noted its well-kept face, and recommended conscripting such skill into John's service. The thought chilled the smith more than morning frost. Iron for a king's war paid coin, but coin can't mend a conscience ground thin beneath marching boots. He was lucky. Another smith in a neighboring hamlet, accused on thinner evidence, vanished after a midnight inquiry. Villagers later found his hammer by the riverbank, haft snapped, head rusting. Wordless justice, the kind kingdoms dispense when vengeance seeks a target. Months rolled on. The arrow's ripples grew wider. Normandy lost to Philip. Magna Carta's seed planted in baronial discontent. Crusading fervor diverted into dynastic squabbles. The smith kept shaping plowshares, but every clang now echoed with empire's unintended soundtrack. Sometimes, when the hearth embers burned low, he caught himself staring at a half-finished point, wondering which rib, which lung, which ambition it might one day puncture. He sanded edges duller than clients preferred, citing shortage of charcoal. Better a boar survive a hunt than a prince fall to chance. Years later, when a minstrel wandered through with a new ballad, Arrow of Fate, Lion's Doom, the villagers packed the alehouse to hear it. The smith listened from a corner, ale warm against his palms. The song praised the nameless boy, cursed the arrow, exalted divine providence. Nobody mentioned the hand that forged the metal, or the hearth that fed it flame. When the chorus rose, the smith mouthed the words but made no sound. He died of a winter chill, not long after John lost Normandy for good. His tools passed to an apprentice, who etched his own initials into every blade. Certain fame lay in signature. The original hammer, its face pitted, found its way into a barn where it quietly rusted among threshing flails. Centuries later, antiquarians catalogued regional smithing styles and argued over who had armed the fatal crossbow. They traced patterns, compared alloys, hypothesized workshops, but the hammer remained silent, orange with decay, bearing witness without testimony. History loves heroes, villains, and victims. It seldom spares ink for the hands that shape their weapons. Yet each clang beneath that anonymous roof reverberates still, through parliaments birthed by dynastic collapse, through borders redrawn because one king died in mud. If you stand in a French meadow at dusk and listen between crickets, you might imagine phantom hammer blows, forging futures no chronicle can fully credit. And somewhere in the dark, an unmarked grave holds the bones of a craftsman who once believed iron was simply iron, never guessing it could become the hinge on which a continent turned. Imagine a traveler, let's call him the stranger, ambling through the Limousin woods in that same spring of 1199. A quarrel winds from nowhere, catches him high in the shoulder, and punches through mail into flesh. The point snaps off. The shaft dangles like a rude signpost. At first, the stranger winces, curses the marksman's luck, and lurches toward the nearest hamlet for help. But the true contest has only just begun, because in the 12th century, survival after steel is a wager against time, chance, and medieval medicine's rough arithmetic. The stranger stumbles into a thatched cottage where a midwife doubles as surgeon. She lays him on a slatted table sticky with lambing grease, snips away his tunic, and peers at the wound, ragged, purple-rimmed, seeping dark blood that smells like copper and earth. Rule 1, remove the arrow, requires grip and nerve. Her tongs slip, barbs tear deeper, opening muscle that pulses like a startled fish. Blood beads, then gushes. She packs moss and goose fat into the hole, muttering Ave Marias, while the stranger bites a leather strap. Pain clouds his senses, but for now, the bleeding slows. Round 1 to the stranger. By dusk, fever creeps in, subtle as rising fog. His pulse kicks faster, cheeks flush crimson, sweat dries salty on his brow. The midwife warms a crock of wine over hearth coals, mixes in thyme and a pinch of powdered silver, luxury snatched from a pilgrim's discarded brooch, and pours it through a funnel into the wound. He screams, thrashes, almost topples the table. Silver ions might kill what they call body worms, she explains, though no one has ever seen such creatures. Steam rises, the wound hisses, fever holds its ground. Night falls. Wolves howl beyond hedgerows. The midwife lights a tallow candle scented with rosemary to mask the smell of blood. Rule 2, keep corruption out, proves harder when the cottage swarms with flies fat on spring manure. She flaps a rag. They settle again, drawn by warmth and iron. One slips past her sleeve and lands on the stranger's bandage, tasting the dampness with delicate feet. Every touch, a potential death sentence, microscopic maggots waiting to hatch where flesh forgets it once belonged to itself. Day 2. The stranger's arm balloons, skin stretched glossy, purple streaks climb toward his collarbone, a roadmap for sepsis. He babbles half-formed prayers, confuses the midwife's face with his mother's, then apologizes for a sin he won't name. She heats an iron poker and presses it to the puncture. Sizzle. The cottage fills with a smell like singed hair and pork crackling. Cautery seals vessels, but also locks infection inside. Round 2 tilts toward the wound. A traveling friar arrives, hears groans, offers holy oil and relic dust, shaven from St. Sebastian's arrow shafts. The midwife lets him sprinkle the shapeless powder over gauze. The stranger chokes on his own saliva, eyes rolling white. The friar intones psalms. Outside, rain pelts thatch until water dribbles through cracks, turning dirt floor to mud beneath the stretcher legs. Day 3. Fever spikes. The stranger's breath rasps, lungs filling with fluid as if drowning on dry land. The midwife mixes a purge, wormwood, vinegar, and pigeon droppings, hoping to draw humors downward. He retches bile, loses what little water he kept. Dehydration shrivels lips, darkens urine to syrup. His pulse falters, fingertips bruise where blood no longer dares circulate. News of his suffering drifts to a nearby manor. The Lord Surgeon, educated in Salerno, arrives wielding steel scalpels, eager for reputation. He slices a fresh channel beside the wound to let the poison bleed. Thick ichor oozes, the smell clears even the flies. For one miraculous hour, the stranger's eyes sharpen, color returns to cheeks, and hope tiptoes in. But night steals the gain. Rule 3, balance humors, proves as elusive as a straight shadow by candlelight. Day 4, delirium. He swats invisible gnats, begs for snow to cool him. The surgeon orders a poultice of bread soaked in goat milk. It molds before noon. His temperature climbs past counting. Each heartbeat hammers like a blacksmith missing the anvil. Livid patches bloom across ribs, septic emboli heralding systemic collapse. The midwife crosses herself. The surgeon mutters that perhaps gangrene has reached the heart. Day 5. Dawn's first light shows mottled skin, jaw slack, eyes glassy. He exhales once, long, ragged, and does not inhale again. Candles burn low. The midwife closes lids with coins she cannot spare. The surgeon records the outcome, mortuous. In a corner, the arrowhead sits on a chipped plate, still stained dark. Iron, wood, feathers, no longer than a man's hand, has won the wager. The stranger's cloak becomes shroud, his possessions divided between church tithe and landlord's claim. Within a week, gossip names his death a warning. Keep mail patched, avoid outlaw woods, trust God's mercy, but not your skin. Could anyone have survived? Perhaps, if the poultice were clean linen soaked in boiled water, if the arrow were withdrawn by reverse threading rather than yanked, if honey, nature's unpatented antibiotic, sealed the cavity, if hands scrubbed with ash and soap before touching raw tissue. Simple measures modern minds deem obvious, medieval ones called extravagant. Richard Plantagenet lacked them. So did the stranger. Infection, unchallenged, extended its dominion. 8 centuries later, a medical student reviews post-mortem notes in a bright laboratory where steel gleams sterile and antibiotics wait in plastic vials. She clicks her tongue at the primitive care, certain she would have saved the patient. Yet she knows hospital wards where bacteria laugh at penicillin's ghost, where wounds refuse to close, where human arrogance still pulses hot beneath gauze. As she closes the file, a stray thought lingers. Maybe the past is not past. Maybe the arrow is always nocked, its path simply choosing different skies. The stranger fades into collective forgetting, but the lesson remains etched like a scar on civilization's body. In 1199, a wound was not merely a hole. It was an open door to kingdoms of unseen killers. And too often, the killers marched unopposed. At dawn, when dew still silvered the nettles below Chalut Chabrol, the boy, nobody ever bothered to fix his age past young, rose from a straw pallet that smelled of goat and unfinished dreams. His mother was already gone to the dairy. His father, lost to some past campaign, existed only as a dents and scratches legend recited over winter embers. The boy stretched, scratched a flea bite, and felt the day crackle with the idle daring of adolescence. Outside, pigs rooted in last night's peelings, unconcerned by rumors that a king crouched somewhere beyond the tree line. Kings, to pigs, are merely louder versions of thunder. He did not wake intending to commit regicide. He woke intending to avoid chores. The crossbow leaning against the shed solved that problem, promising a morning free from mucking stalls. He grabbed it, more comfortable with the heft of wood than with any concept of providence, and padded barefoot toward the castle wall where older boys sometimes practiced on painted targets. The quarrel pouch held only 3 bolts. He preferred the middle one because its fletching still boasted intact crow feathers. They made the shaft look important. Below, in the fields, the Lionheart's camp seethed, banners lifting, horses snorting steam, kettle drums thumping a heartbeat far larger than the boy's own. He had heard singers call Richard a colossus, a storm wrapped in armor, a sword swung by God. Maybe that was true in Jerusalem. From up here, he looked like any other man shouting instructions his troops already knew. The boy knocked the bolt, squinted along the stock, and yanked the bowstring back until it clicked. A satisfying sound, like a secret locking into place. The king, resplendent in a cloak embroidered with lions, glimmered under morning light. A living target so vivid he seemed conjured for the sole purpose of being aimed at. The boy licked cracked lips. What was the worst that could happen? The bolt would miss and clang off a shield. Some knight might yell curses that the boy would later repeat to friends, abridged and bragging. Chores would still wait, but the tale would outrun them. Finger to trigger, he inhaled. A bird lifted off the wall, startled. His heart jumped in unison, and the bolt tore free before he meant it. He did not even feel the recoil, only the sudden, empty hush inside the bow. The quarrel traced an invisible arc, the perfect geometry of youthful impulse, and disappeared into the king's armpit seam as neatly as a lesson sliding into a pupil's mind. There was no dramatic clang, no shower of sparks, just a small, unimpressive thunk, and the sight of Richard's shoulders stiffening as though somebody had tapped him too hard to get directions. Silence fell, thick enough to chew. Then a ripple of disbelief rolled through both armies. Even the pigs paused. The boy's breath stuck halfway between lungs and sky. He waited for thunder, for lightning, for some cosmic rebuke. Instead, the king reached up, gripped the shaft, and, absurdly, laughed. The sound boomed across the field, a veteran amused by inconvenience. But laughter cannot stitch flesh. Blood began to seep, slow at first, then insistently, as if the body itself had decided on a different ruler. The boy's knees softened. He thought of his mother, of unfinished chores, of a future suddenly narrowed to a single trembling moment. Voices below rose and tangled. Archers scanned the battlements. Crossbows pivoted, and someone shouted for ladders. The boy pressed his back against the battlement stone, heart sprinting. He had not meant to become history's hinge. He had meant to skip shoveling goat droppings. By sundown, rumors spread like spilled grain. Some claimed the shot had been vengeance for a brother hanged during taxation riots. Others insisted the boy was guided by angels offended by crusader arrogance. A particularly inventive soldier swore he saw the shaft glow with holy fire. The child himself, hauled before the dying king days later, could only stammer an apology wrapped in tears. Richard, skin jaundiced, voice ragged, pardoned him with a weariness that felt older than kingdoms. "Live on," the monarch rasped, "and remember." Mercy as punishment. The lamb would bear the lion's ghost everywhere he walked. But memory is cruel cargo. After Richard died, revenge looked for a vessel and found the boy's fragile body. Amid torches and wine-fueled fury, soldiers dragged him to a tree, flayed his back while he screamed a king's name that no longer held power. They claimed justice. Really, they wanted closure, and closure is seldom satisfied with a child's thin cries. At dawn, they left him hanging, skin striped red, an accidental assassin reduced to carrion for sparrows. Lamb indeed, one sacrificed so the legion might pretend order had been restored. Stories diverged. Some villagers whispered the lad slipped free, healed into a hermit who fed birds and never touched iron again. Balladeers preferred the martyr version. Innocence shredded under the same sky that watched a monarch melt. Chroniclers, craving neat moral knots, wrote the boy anonymous, a symbol rather than a son. He became the Lamb, shorthand for chance, reminding every fence-post philosopher that fate need not choose mighty instruments. It can pick up what lies nearest, a rusty bolt, an aimless child, and tilt empires off their axes. Centuries later, historians would comb archives for any mention of his baptismal name, his parentage, his burial plot. Records remained silent, as though embarrassed by how little paperwork a world-changing moment requires. In dusty libraries, scholars sighed over the gap, then published new theses anyway, footnoting speculation with diligent hope. Yet sometimes, on evenings when mist curls along Limousin valleys, local shepherds claim they hear faint laughter in the ruined keep, neither boyish giggle nor regal guffaw, but a strange blend, as if arrow and target still trade jokes across time's abyss. They insist a shadow sits on the battlement, small and indistinct, watching fields where armies once camped. Perhaps it waits for someone to explain why curiosity cost him everything, why mercy failed, why legends forget the lamb after praising the lion's roar. The irony lingers like a thorn in Europe's thumb. That greatness, armored in reputation and steel, was felled by uncalculated mischief. That empire can hinge on a moment not of strategy or prophecy, but of childish boredom. Kings modeled themselves on beasts of power, yet sometimes the meek inherit not the earth, but the final word. Richard's epitaph glitters in gold leaf. The boy's is a silence loud enough to echo through centuries. Together, they form a single sentence carved in the stone of unintended consequences. Greatness is only as invulnerable as the smallest hand's aim.